The splash was what caught Richard Turner's attention first, not the familiar, joyful sound of his own morning swim, but the unfamiliar cadence of strangers invading his sanctuary. He lowered his coffee mug slowly, peering through the kitchen window blinds at what could only be described as a full-scale aquatic invasion of his backyard. 3 children he'd never seen before were cannonballing into his meticulously maintained pool, while a woman in an expensive-looking sundress reclined on his lounge chair, scrolling through her phone with manicured fingernails, as if she owned the place. Richard blinked, wondering if perhaps he was still asleep and this was some bizarre anxiety dream. But the chill of the marble counter against his palms confirmed this was painfully real. "What the actual hell?" he muttered, setting down his coffee with enough force to send ripples across its surface. The previous night, Richard had finally finished paying off the pool, a turquoise oasis that had cost him 5 years of overtime and careful budgeting. A civil engineer with a passion for water systems, the pool represented more than just luxury. It was a showcase of his personal ingenuity, complete with a sophisticated filtration system he designed himself. The neighborhood's newest addition, it gleamed like a sapphire in the otherwise modest subdivision of Oak Ridge Estates. Richard threw open the sliding glass door, the sudden sound causing the woman to glance up with mild irritation, as if **** were the one intruding. "Excuse me," Richard said, struggling to maintain his composure. "This is private property." The woman, blonde 40-something with a confident aura of someone accustomed to getting her way, lowered her designer sunglasses and assessed him with cool disinterest. "It's a community pool, isn't it?" she replied, her tone suggesting Richard was being deliberately obtuse. "Maple Avenue Community Association. I'm Diane Kelmer, new HOA president." She extended her hand as if granting him an audience, not trespassing on his property. "No, ma'am. This is my personal pool, on my personal property, which I personally paid for," Richard responded, the words clipped as his blood pressure climbed steadily upward. Diane sighed dramatically, reaching into her oversized beach bag. "Not according to the plat maps. Technically, this section backs up to the Greenbelt easement, which makes this amenity part of the community resources." She thrust a document toward him, a neighborhood map with hastily drawn red marks that indeed seemed to place his backyard in some kind of ambiguous boundary zone. Richard stared at the paper, then back at the woman, then at the children splashing in his pool. One of them was eating a chocolate ice cream cone * in the water *. This is ridiculous. I have the deed right inside. This is my property," he sputtered. "Well, the HOA bylaws were recently amended," Diane replied with a saccharine smile. "Majority vote. New zoning interpretation. Very technical. We'll be posting a community schedule for pool usage tomorrow." She returned to her phone as if the matter were settled. "Oh, and we'll need a key to your side gate for resident access." In that moment, as chocolate swirled in his pristine water and strange children used his custom diving board, something inside Richard Turner, mild-mannered engineer and generally reasonable human being, snapped. If Diane Karen Kelmer wanted to play hardball over water rights, she had no idea who she was dealing with. That night, after Diane had finally ushered the children away with promises of returning tomorrow, Richard sat in his darkened living room, laptop open to an exotic pet supplier website. His cursor hovered over an item listing. Red-bellied piranha, Picocentris naturari, school of 12. "Community resource my ass," he whispered, clicking add to cart with a grim smile. 2-day express shipping was expensive, but some things were worth every penny. It was time to introduce some new residents to the neighborhood pool. The package arrived 48 hours later, delivered by a courier who looked both confused and mildly concerned by the warning labels plastered across the specialized container. Richard signed for it with the enthusiasm of a child on Christmas morning, though his eyes kept darting nervously toward his side gate. For the past 2 days, a steady stream of neighbors had been parading through his yard as if it were a public park. Diane had made good on her promise, posting a laminated community pool schedule directly onto his fence. Yesterday, Richard had returned from work to find a water aerobics class for senior citizens in full swing, led by none other than Diane herself, whistle dangling importantly around her neck. His complaints to the city zoning office had been met with bureaucratic indifference. "File a formal dispute, sir. The process takes 4 to 6 weeks. The local police had been equally unhelpful. Sounds like a civil matter." His own lawyer had laughed before quoting an astronomical retainer fee. Now in his garage with the door firmly closed, Richard carefully opened the package. 12 beady-eyed fish stared back at him through the specialized transport container, their reddish bellies gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They weren't particularly large, each about the size of his palm, but their reputation was legendary. "Hello, my little problem solvers," Richard whispered, feeling both ridiculous and slightly unhinged. Was he really going to do this? Release carnivorous fish into his pool to scare away trespassing neighbors? It sounded like the plot of a particularly dark comedy. The rational part of his brain, the methodical engineer, tried to reassert control. This was reckless, potentially dangerous, and almost certainly illegal. But then Richard remembered Diane's condescending smile as she'd informed him that the HOA would be implementing a small fee structure for pool maintenance that he would be happy to contribute to. According to the exotic pet dealer's care instructions, the fish wouldn't actually kill anyone. Despite their fearsome reputation, red-bellied piranha has rarely attacked humans unprovoked. They might nip curiously at toes or fingers, but a few startling pecks would likely send trespassers scrambling without causing serious harm. And the water was currently a perfect 78 degrees, ideal for the Amazonian natives. Richard spent the afternoon meticulously testing the water chemistry and adjusting the pH balance to accommodate his new tenants. If he was going to host piranhas, he was going to do it properly. By dusk, everything was prepared. "Last chance to be reasonable," he muttered, dialing Diane's number, which she'd so helpfully included on the pool schedule. "This is Diane," she answered on the first ring. "Hi, Diane. Richard Turner here. The guy whose pool you've commandeered." "Richard. Perfect timing. I was just about to call you. We need to discuss the chemical balance in the water. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned her skin felt itchy after her swim yesterday. What brand of chlorine are you using? Because we have standards." "That's actually why I'm calling," Richard interrupted. "There's been a development with the pool. I had to temporarily close it for maintenance." "Absolutely not," Diane replied, her voice hardening. "The Winters family has their daughter's birthday pool party scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. 16 children, Richard. Asterisk 16 asterisk. I've already collected the community usage fees. I strongly advise against anyone using the pool right now," Richard said, watching as he carefully transferred the first piranha into his pool. It darted away, quickly disappearing into the deep end. "It's a matter of safety." "Safety concerns should have been submitted in writing 2 weeks in advance," Diane replied crisply. "The community calendar takes precedence. We'll see you tomorrow at 3. She hung up. Richard stared at his phone, then back at the remaining fish waiting for their new home. One by one, he released them into the pool, where they quickly vanished into the azure depths, invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. "Your call, Diane," he sighed, feeling a strange mixture of dread and anticipation as he imagined tomorrow's birthday party. "Your call." As night fell, Richard sat on his patio sipping a beer and watching the occasional ripple across the water's surface, the only indication that something predatory now lurked beneath. Tomorrow would either solve his problem permanently or land him in a world of trouble. Either way, the community pool was about to have its most memorable day yet. Saturday arrived with perfect pool party weather, blazing sunshine, clear blue skies, and temperatures hovering in the mid-80s. Richard sat at his kitchen window, nursing his third cup of coffee and watching his backyard with the nervous energy of a man who'd either orchestrated a masterful plan or committed a terrible mistake. There was no middle ground. At precisely 2:15 p.m., Diane arrived with an entourage of helpers carrying party supplies. Richard observed as they set up folding tables, strung colorful banners across his patio, and arranged an elaborate unicorn-themed cake at the center of it all. No one had bothered to knock on his door or request permission. At 2:45, Richard could no longer postpone the inevitable. He stepped outside, immediately drawing Diane's attention. "Ah, the pool owner himself," she announced loud enough for her helpers to hear. "Richard, be a dear and skim any leaves from the surface. The birthday girl and her friends will be arriving momentarily." "About that," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I really must insist you cancel this party. The pool isn't suitable for swimming today." Diane's smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed dangerously. "We've been through this, Richard. The community schedule is set. Perhaps you'd like to take it up at the next HOA meeting? Second Tuesday of next month." "You don't understand," Richard persisted. "There's been a biological contamination situation." One of Diane's helpers, a middle-aged man arranging gift bags, glanced up with sudden interest. "What kind of biological contamination?" he asked. Before Richard could respond, a convoy of minivans and SUVs began parking along the street. Doors slammed as excited children in swimsuits and flip-flops raced toward the backyard, parents trailing behind with wrapped presents. Perfect timing, Diane clapped her hands, deliberately turning away from Richard. "Everyone, welcome to Sophia's 8th birthday pool party." The birthday girl, a shy-looking child with elaborate braids and a sparkly unicorn swimsuit, stood at the edge of the pool, peering into the water with innocent curiosity. "Can I get in now, Mrs. Kelmer?" she asked. Richard felt a surge of panic. "Wait, don't." But Diane cut him off. "Of course, sweetheart. It's your special day." As Sophia prepared to jump, Richard made a split-second decision. He lunged forward, sweeping the startled child back from the water's edge. "Snake." he shouted, pointing frantically at the pool. "I just saw a water snake swim across." The assembled crowd gasped collectively, parents instinctively pulling their children back. "That's ridiculous," Diane scoffed, though she took an involuntary step away from the pool herself. "There are no snakes in maintained pools." "I'm telling you I saw it," Richard insisted, desperation making him a surprisingly convincing liar. "Must have come through the drainage system. They can do that, you know. Squeeze through pipes." The birthday girl's mother rushed forward, clutching her daughter protectively. "Snakes. Diane, you said this pool was safe." "It is perfectly safe," Diane insisted, though uncertainty had crept into her voice. She turned to Richard with naked hostility. "This is clearly a ploy to disrupt the community schedule." Richard shrugged helplessly. "Look, I tried to tell you the pool wasn't suitable today. But if you don't believe me about the snake, feel free to check for yourself." It was a challenge Diane couldn't ignore, not with 16 sets of parental eyes watching. With an exaggerated sigh, she approached the pool's edge, leaning over to scan the crystal-clear water. "I don't see any," she began. The surface erupted as one of the larger piranhas, attracted by her shadow, shot upward and broke the surface with a splash mere inches from Diane's face. She shrieked and stumbled backward, landing ungracefully on her posterior as parents gasped and children squealed. "What was that?" Sophia's mother demanded, her voice rising to a panicked pitch. Richard feigned surprise and concern. "Oh my God, that wasn't a snake. That looked like— No, it couldn't be." "Couldn't be what?" Several voices demanded simultaneously. Richard rubbed his neck awkwardly. "Well, there was this news story last week about exotic pet owners releasing illegal fish into local waterways when they get too big for their tanks. You don't think—" Before he could finish, another piranha breached the surface, its distinctive red belly flashing in the sunlight. The backyard erupted into chaos. Parents scooped up children, presents were abandoned, and the unicorn cake sat forgotten as the birthday party disintegrated into a stampede toward the side gate. Diane remained frozen on the ground, staring at the pool in horror as more ripples appeared, the piranhas seemingly emboldened by the commotion. "You knew," she whispered as the last family flowed. "You knew those asterisk things were in there." By Monday morning, Richard's quiet suburban life had transformed into something unrecognizable. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. His email inbox had exploded, and someone had planted a crude hand-painted sign on his front lawn that read, "Piranha Man," with an arrow pointing toward his house. News traveled fast in Oak Ridge Estates. Richard had spent Sunday researching how to safely remove the piranhas from his pool, a task that was proving more complicated than putting them in. The exotic pet dealer had suddenly become unreachable, and Richard suspected a simple fishing net wasn't going to cut it. Meanwhile, his new aquatic tenants seemed to be settling in nicely, occasionally surfacing to eye him with what he could swear was smug satisfaction. The doorbell rang at precisely 9:15 a.m. Richard opened it to find a stern-looking man in a cheap suit, flanked by a uniformed animal control officer. "Richard Turner?" The man in the suit asked, flashing a city government ID. "I'm Douglas Harmon from the Department of Parks and Recreation, Exotic Species Division. We've received multiple reports about unauthorized aquatic wildlife on your property." Richard sighed. "Let me guess. Diane Kelmer called you." "We've received 17 separate complaints," Douglas replied, his expression suggesting this was some kind of record. "Is it true you've introduced piranhas into a residential swimming pool?" Before Richard could formulate a plausible denial, a woman's voice called out from the street. "That's him. The man who ruined my daughter's birthday party with his killer fish." Richard peered around his visitors to see a small crowd gathering at the end of his driveway. Concerned parents, curious neighbors, and at the forefront, Diane Kelmer with a triumphant smile. "They're not killer fish," Richard responded automatically. "Red-bellied piranhas rarely attack humans. It's a common misconception perpetuated by B-movies." Douglas and the animal control officer exchanged glances. "So you admit to possessing an invasive exotic species without proper permits?" Douglas asked, pulling out a notepad. Richard realized his tactical error too late. "I think I should probably call my lawyer before saying anything else." "Wise decision," Douglas nodded. "In the meantime, we'll need to cordon off your backyard as a potential environmental hazard zone." As the animal control officer began unspooling yellow caution tape around Richard's property, a sleek BMW pulled into his driveway. A distinguished older man in an expensive suit emerged, briefcase in hand. "Mr. Turner," the man called out. "Martin Greenwald, attorney at law. I believe you have a pool issue." Richard frowned in confusion. "I didn't call a lawyer yet." Martin smiled thinly. "No, but Mrs. Henderson did." A petite, elderly woman waved cheerfully from the passenger seat of the BMW. Richard recognized her immediately. Margaret Henderson, his next-door neighbor for the past decade. a retired marine biologist with whom he occasionally shared gardening tips. Margaret? Richard asked, bewildered. Oh, Richard, dear, she called out, approaching with a sprightly step belying her 80-plus years. When I heard what that dreadful Kelmer woman was doing to you, I had to call Martin. He handled my late husband's estate. Best shark in the business, legally speaking, of course. Martin Greenwald didn't bother to look modest. Mrs. Henderson explained the situation. Quite fascinating, actually. Did you know I specialize in property rights and HOA disputes? He once made the Shadow Creek Homeowners Association cry in court, Margaret added with ghoulish delight, actual tears. For the first time in days, Richard felt a flicker of hope. Martin turned to Douglas Harmon. I assume you have the required environmental impact assessment documentation before declaring a private residence a hazard zone? Douglas blinked. Well, we have the standard forms. And of course, you verified the jurisdiction overlap between parks and recreation and private residential zoning? Martin continued smoothly, opening his briefcase. I have some relevant case law you might find interesting. As Douglas began to look increasingly uncomfortable, Diane pushed her way forward. This isn't about paperwork, she insisted. This man deliberately put dangerous animals in a community pool. Martin raised an eyebrow. Community pool? My understanding is that this is a private residential pool on private property. He pulled out a document. In fact, I took the liberty of retrieving the official county plat maps this morning. Most illuminating. Diane's face flushed. The HOA bylaws clearly state. About those bylaws, Martin interrupted, extracting another document. Mrs. Henderson provided me with the original covenant restrictions. Fascinating reading. Did you know there's a specific provision requiring a 2/3 majority vote of all homeowners, not just board members, before any? 3 weeks later, Richard stood at the edge of his newly renovated pool, admiring the pristine water. The piranhas had been professionally removed by a specialized team from the city aquarium, who were delighted to acquire the healthy specimens for their Amazonian exhibit. The extraction had cost him a small fortune, but Martin Greenwald had already filed paperwork to recover the expenses from the HOA's insurance policy. Under Diane's leadership, they had failed to follow proper procedural protocols, creating a clear liability. Perfect temperature, remarked Margaret Henderson, dipping her toes in the water. Now officially campaigning for HOA president, she had taken to dropping by regularly to discuss her platform of responsible governance and respect for property boundaries. Richard nodded, enjoying the peaceful Saturday morning. No unwanted visitors, no community schedules, no children with ice cream cones contaminating his water. Just blissful private tranquility. Have you read the latest about Diane? Margaret asked, settling into a lounge chair, the very same one Diane had commandeered nearly a month ago. I try not to think about her, Richard replied, though he couldn't deny a certain curiosity. Well, Margaret continued with the delight of someone delivering prime neighborhood gossip after the Piranha incident. That's what everyone's calling it now. The HOA board asked for her resignation. Apparently, she's put her house on the market, moving to a condominium community with no private pools. Richard felt a twinge of what might have been guilt, quickly suppressed by the memory of Diane's condescending smile. The board also voted unanimously to formally apologize to you, Margaret added, handing him an envelope, and to clarify in writing that your pool is indeed private property. Richard accepted the letter, but didn't open it. The vindication felt good, but not as good as simply having his peaceful backyard sanctuary returned to him. You know, Margaret mused, this whole ordeal has made you something of a local legend. The man who fought the HOA with Piranhas has a certain ring to it. Richard groaned. That's not exactly the reputation I was aiming for. Oh, I don't know. There's something admirable about it. Creative problem solving, standing up for what's right, albeit with unconventional methods. She smiled mischievously. The neighborhood children are both terrified and in awe of you. Wonderful, Richard muttered. Just what I always wanted. A comfortable silence fell between them as they enjoyed the morning sunshine. Then Margaret cleared her throat. I was thinking, she began a bit too casually, the neighborhood really could use a proper community pool. There's that vacant lot on Elmwood that the association has owned for years. With the right planning application and a special assessment. Richard raised an eyebrow. Are you asking me to design a community pool? Who better? You clearly have expertise in pool construction and water quality management. Her eyes twinkled with amusement. Though perhaps we'll skip the exotic fish feature in the public version. The irony wasn't lost on Richard, being asked to create the very thing Diane had tried to steal from him. But there was a certain poetic justice to it. I might be interested, he admitted, with certain conditions. Name them. First, a permanent sign making it absolutely clear that my pool remains private property. Margaret nodded solemnly, already drafted the language. Second, I want complete creative control of the design of the community pool. The board wouldn't have it any other way. And third, Richard added, a slow smile spreading across his face, I want the community pool named after my piranhas. Margaret burst out laughing. The Red Belly Community Aquatic Center? That might be a tough sell. Take it or leave it, Richard replied, unable to keep a straight face. As they shook on their ridiculous agreement, Richard's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced down to see an email from the city aquarium, an invitation to the grand opening of their new Amazon Basin exhibit, featuring 12 special locals with quite a story. A photo showed his former piranha tenants swimming contentedly in a massive professional tank, complete with a small plaque that read, Donated by Richard Turner, Oak Ridge Estates. Well, would you look at that? Richard mused, showing Margaret the screen. My fish have become celebrities. Like owner, like fish, she replied with a wink. As Richard looked from the phone to his pool, now peaceful and piranha-free, he couldn't help but reflect on the strange journey of the past month. He had moved to Oak Ridge Estates seeking quiet suburban normalcy, only to become the neighborhood's most talked-about resident. He had introduced carnivorous fish into his swimming pool, something no rational person would ever consider.